I'm going to take off from where the chairman just left off with a point of view that I think is very important, that when we have violence against election officials, it's probably pretty closely tied to a lot of problems we have within our society, including what you've heard most of my opening statement about the rise in crime and what we're doing about it, and we're doing enough about it. Now, I have a big, long lead into my first question that I'm going to summarize because you heard a lot of what I would be repeating now in my opening statement. But in that opening statement, I referred to Operation Legend, Project Safe Neighborhoods. Now, one of the websites of the Department of Justice said, in regard to Project Safe Neighborhood, the fundamental goal of this work is not to increase the number of arrests or prosecutions as if they were an end in themselves. And I think we've seen what the change in philosophy of prosecutions and letting people out have done. So it is very important to combat election violence. But why is it not just as important as my first question, to create a task force dedicated to leverage federal resources against historic murder rates? Mr. Polite.
Senator, I welcome this question, so thank you very much for raising it. My decision to become a prosecutor in the very first place was motivated to fight violent crime. Like many of us, I have a family that suffered the loss of a loved one due to violent crime. My father and brother are both law enforcement, so a lot of the issues that you're raising are very personal for me. We have a lot of prosecutorial priorities within the Department of Justice and within the criminal division. Violent crime is at the very top of that. Today we are here to talk about one category of violent crime, but when we talk about violent crime that we're seeing in our streets and across our country, that remains at the top of the department's priorities as well.
But not as top as creating a task force for, like there is for crime against election officials, evidently.
Senator, respectfully, I would disagree with that. There have been a number of strike forces that have been established and announced by Attorney General Garland in some of the cities across this country that have reflected the highest rates of increases of violent crime. That is in partnership with ATF, that is focused on deterring and addressing violent crime that is being perpetrated by the most culpable individuals in those respective jurisdictions.
Let me follow on where you just left off. Attorney General Garland made statements to this committee indicating that the Department of Justice had formed a task force on, quote, safety of federal prosecutors, law enforcement agencies, judges, members of Congress, end of quote, back in March of 2021. It's not mentioned in any public-facing statement by the Department of Justice, and neither my staff nor the Congressional Research Service has been able to confirm it exists. Does this task force exist, and will the department create a dedicated task force to leverage federal resources to combat the murder of police officers? And if the task force does exist, where do we find that information?
Senator, thank you very much for that question. I can certainly get more details to you related to the task force itself. What I can tell you, though, is that the impetus behind that task force, protecting our law enforcement personnel across this country, it remains a high priority for me, for the division, and for all of the department. It is not limited to just the work of some particular task force. It is, in fact, the work of the entire department and our U.S. attorneys and law enforcement partners on a day-to-day basis.
So far, the department has been unwilling to prosecute those who intimidate Supreme Court justices in their homes, even if the federal statute forbids this behavior. Will you change course and prosecute those who intimidated the justices?
Senator, again, another example of a very high priority, another example of violence in our community addressed against anyone, regardless of their title or status, remains a priority for the department. Just recently, the District of Maryland's U.S. Attorney's Office, in fact, charged one of the individuals that was involved in unlawful, serious, threatening conduct at the home of one of our Supreme Court justices. In addition, our Attorney General has met with law enforcement, federal law enforcement, and has in fact charged the U.S. Marshals with providing additional security for all of our Supreme Court justices.
Can I ask one more question, my last one, and more directly towards this hearing? What resources in terms of agencies supporting, number of staff, and funding have been directed to the Elections Threat Task Force as a result of this use of scarce federal resources? How many individuals have been prosecuted for acts of physical violence against election officials?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator. We have charged 5 cases as part of the task force. As to any ongoing investigations, I can't comment as to the existence or non-existence of additional investigations.
Did that involve violence, criminal violence against the people?
Those 5 cases all involve serious threats of unlawful violence.
Senator Feinstein.